Hello, and welcome to this week's episode. We are talking today about bouncing back from negative feedback. And as is so often the case with our episodes, this is inspired by our conversations with clients. And we've recognized that receiving negative feedback is something that every leader faces, but nobody really teaches you how to handle it well. And when it hits in the moment, it can hit pretty hard. So, we are talking about how it can be a really effective career skill to be able to handle that situation and to be able to emerge at least relatively unscathed from it. So, Pam, this is a really tricky one, isn't it? Because when people hear something negative, the natural reaction is that the hackles go up. It feels really tough to be on the receiving end of.
Yeah, it is tough, isn't it? Even now, I don't enjoy receiving negative feedback, and I don't think anybody does. And I think where that comes from is that it's so easy to tie our sense of self-worth to performance and feel like that feedback is directly attacking us rather than taking a moment to think, where is it coming from? And can I do anything with it? Or is it just this person's personal opinion? And I think that's where we get so caught up in negative feedback because as soon as you hear it, depending on what it is and depending on what your insecurities are, it can hit at all different levels, can't it?
Yeah, I think for me, when I'm talking to clients where they're in situations where they doubt themselves, that's where it hits the hardest because then if somebody critiques or gives you something that's not even particularly bad, but even the slightest bit of negative feedback, if you're already feeling self-doubt, that feels like a confirmation of your absolute worst fears. And I think that can create a very emotive reaction. So, yeah, I think all of this is so normal. And if there are people out there that have not experienced this kind of wounded feeling in response to negative feedback, they are in a very severe minority. So if you're listening to this and this is something that you recognize can be the case for you, then you are far from alone. And we wanted to talk about it, didn't we? Because there's a vicious cycle and a virtuous cycle that can happen. And being able to handle negative feedback is a really important career skill. And it just doesn't get talked about often. So, what talk us through why this matters?
So I think the main reason why it matters is because when we receive negative feedback and it hits us in all different ways, how we respond and react to it really does determine how we progress in our careers and the way people see us and perceive us and all of that kind of stuff. And I think that this is a muscle that you need to work because you're not going to get negative feedback on the daily. So when you get it, it's wow. And sometimes it can absolutely take your breath away. And this is where I think you can really start flexing the muscle. So when the negative feedback comes in, you can go, okay, and recognize it as what it is, and then start thinking about how you break that down and how you react to it and what are you feeling around that. Because I think people sometimes can react badly to feedback and become defensive and shut down, and it takes away that ability to be able to deal with it and learn something from the situation or to be able to respond in positive way.
I completely agree. And I think the thing is, if you, which is natural, feel defensive, feel attacked, then the natural thing then is to shut down, to be upset, to try and avoid the situation, to try and rationalize it, to try and ignore it and hope that feedback doesn't come again. And those emotive reactions create a vicious cycle because what happens then is people perceive that they can tell that's upset you or that's difficult for you to hear. And that makes it difficult for them to give feedback because they don't want to generally people that you work with that care about you don't want to give you feedback that is going to prompt that emotive reaction. So therefore, what happens is you don't get to hear some of the stuff that could actually be useful, be helpful, enable you to grow your career, improve your performance. So when you are able to manage and handle that reaction and enable that situation where you can receive feedback and receive it well, even though it might sting and might hurt, you create the opposite. You create the situation where it's easier for people to give you that feedback, even if they deliver it clumsily, even if it's not particularly accurate or even correct. If you're the kind of person who is able to handle that, you make it easier for other people to give it. And therefore, in and amongst some of the stuff that might be unfair or unreasonable or difficult to hear, you will get some golden nuggets that will allow you to improve your performance, to do better in that same type of situation next time, to take things on board. And so your ability to respond to feedback in a way that is productive is absolutely a crucial skill to allow you to get to hear different perspectives that might otherwise be uncomfortable for people to deliver.
Yeah, and I think as well, when you hear that feedback, it is so easy to just jump to being defensive or even being offended sometimes, I think as well. And one of the things that I always used to do, because getting negative feedback for me, like in the early stages of my career, I found it really difficult. But like you said there, like if people think that you find it difficult, they're less likely to give it to you, and then you will learn less. And people just won't share things with you. So one of the things I did was just said to people, you can give me the feedback. I'm not easily offended. You just tell me what's on your mind. And sometimes that feedback was their own personal opinion. And it was like, wow, okay, thank you for sharing that. Like, where is that coming from? Now, sometimes I did feel like I could have been offended and probably was offended on the inside, but on the outside, I was very aware of allowing people the space to share what they were feeling and then trying to understand where is that coming from and what can we do about this to move forward. And that was really quite helpful, but also quite difficult. And it was definitely something I had to learn and practice because it wasn't easy in the early days. And even now, if somebody comes to me with negative feedback, I'm like, oh, or I'll always just like we always say, take that pause and take that moment to just think, where is this coming from? Is there any truth in it? And I do think that mindset shift is super important, isn't it?
It really is. And I think when I'm talking to clients about this, so often the conversation is about getting under the skin of the definition of feedback is data that helps to improve performance. So that is what feedback is. And when you hear feedback in a workplace situation, it's rare that it really fits that criteria. So often what we're hearing is opinions, and what you get is information, but it's often one person's perspective at one point in time. It's often not particularly clear, not particularly well delivered. And so I think if you can create that shift where feedback is information, it's a start point, it's not a verdict, it's not career defining. When you can create that mindset of feedback is a start point, it could be useful, then what that allows you to do is separate the feedback from the identity. It separates that whole thing of, instead of this being an attack on my identity, it's okay, that's somebody's perspective at that point in time. And that then calms the nervous system and allows you to be able to then consider and to interrogate and to access some of those tools and techniques that can allow you to receive it better.
Yeah, exactly. And I think one of the examples from one of our listeners around this was around negative feedback and receiving negative feedback on presentations and presentations being too detailed. And that cut deep for that person because they were already thinking, I'm not the best at doing presentations. I don't enjoy doing presentations. I don't really know how to put them together properly. I don't know if I'm getting the story across properly. And then after their last presentation, they got negative feedback to say, your presentations are too detailed and they're not hitting the right audience or they're not relevant for the audience. And that cut deep for that person because they were already thinking, I'm not the best at presentations. So in that situation and that moment, I think you're absolutely right with the feedback being data and it's just information. And it's like that was that one person's perspective. So what can that listener do in order to go away and think it through and really analyze that feedback and see if there's anything to learn from it?
So I think, interestingly, as you describe that, and I'm sure that there will be plenty of other people that have been given that feedback, that first of all, you had that point that we were talking about at the start of that self-doubt in their own presentation ability. It's going to hit harder because then somebody to critique it when they've bust a gut and produced what presumably they felt was their best work. If somebody's cautious and doesn't feel confident with presenting, what they will often do is put a lot of time, a lot of effort, a lot of energy into producing that. And actually, it is quite common then that they will feel like, okay, I need to include this, I need to show my workings, I need to have evidence that I can produce as part of this presentation. So putting a lot of detail in is quite common for people who feel that they lack presentation confidence. So that's going to have hit hard. And I think what's really important there is that piece of feedback is only the start. That person's been told you put too much data in, or it's too detailed, or it's not hitting the right lines for the audience. But that doesn't give them clarity about what was that person expecting that wasn't delivered. What would the right note have been? And so often, when you first get a piece of feedback, this is that point of it's got those two routes. It can go to the virtuous cycle or to the vicious cycle. So by either just taking that and going away and stewing on it doesn't help because you don't get any more clarity about what did that person want instead. What made them say that? Where was the detail that person that gave me that feedback felt was surplus? So in that instance, from a very practical perspective, even though you feel absolutely wounded by that when you've busted gut to try and produce a great presentation, the simple first step is to actually get more information. And it feels counterintuitive because you're like, I want to run from that. I feel really annoyed, really frustrated. I've put all of that into it. But asking the question of, okay, could you tell me how I could improve it for next time? Could you tell me what data did you think was going into too much detail? What did you think the audience would have wanted, or what could I have done to have delivered to that different expectation? Because when people first give you the feedback, they don't tend to give you the full story. They almost test the water and they see how you react or respond. So if your response is, okay, I'll try and do better next time, and you just go away, you're not going to get to that. You're going to have to do a bit more digging, a bit more mining to understand what does good look like for next time. What made you say that? And that's where the nuggets are.
Yeah, and I love that because I think that does two things really well. So the first thing is it gives you the opportunity to learn from someone else, like what could have been better. And then secondly, it gives you the opportunity to see was that just that person's perspective point in time? Was it just because they didn't like the style of presentation and it wasn't the entire audience. It was just them. So it allows you to see whether it is just a personal opinion or perspective, or if there is something you can learn from it. And I think in the moment, as somebody that does not enjoy receiving negative feedback, I think the best thing that you can do in that moment when somebody hits you with that, especially in a work environment and especially when there's high emotions as well, you can just say, "Thanks for the feedback. Let me think about it, and I'll come back to you with some questions if that's okay." And don't be defensive and don't get emotional about it. Just be like, genuinely, "Thank you for that. Thank you for taking the time to give me that feedback. Just let me think about it, and I'll come back to you." And then if you don't feel like you can have the conversation face to face or over the phone, then maybe it's an email that you send and you just say, "Thanks for giving me that feedback. I just like to understand a little bit more about why you thought or why you said what you said," and take it from there and see what they respond with. And then when you get that response back from them, then you can decide then what you do with that information. Because like you say, it's just information, isn't it? And it's further feedback, but then you can see if there's anything that you can take from that, anything that you can learn from that, or if that was just someone's opinion. Sometimes people will just say things without being able to back it up because they felt in a certain way. Maybe they can't deliver presentations in the same way that you can. And there's a whole range of things going on in people's minds that we don't know. But we can definitely take these things and learn from them, or we can just box them away and just be like, "Yeah, that was lovely that you shared that feedback. However, there's nothing there that I can work with. Thanks again." But you can just put it in a box and move on from it.
Yeah. And that point that you made of sometimes creating some distance can really help, because to try and ask more in the moment, if you are still emotional, your body language, your tone is going to convey that you're emotional. And even if you're asking questions, that's not necessarily going to make that person feel comfortable to share more. Whereas if you take some time and reflect and then come back, then you've got some distance and the emotions have subsided. And one of our episodes from the emotional intelligence series was on emotional self-regulation. And I think for people that would recognize that in themselves, that could be a great episode, because that's all about managing your emotions in the moment as opposed to trying to suppress them or ignore them, which is such a useful skill in this instance where feedback is being delivered often quite clumsily.
Yeah, and I think as well, I've been in a situation myself with presentation early in my career, and I was on a leadership course, and everybody had a sponsor, and that person supported them and gave them the brief for a presentation. So I worked with my sponsor on the brief and put the presentation together and everything. And then I went and delivered it. And there's a whole panel, and it was all of the different sponsors on this course. And I delivered mine, and I was so proud of myself. And I was like, do you know what? I don't love doing presentations. In fact, this is quite scary because these are all really senior leaders. And I was a senior leader at that point. I did it. I was really confident, and I could see from their faces that it just wasn't landing well. But I didn't know where it was going wrong. And I was just thinking, this is not going right, but I need to carry on. So I carried on, and I got to the end, and you could literally hear a pin drop. Nobody said anything. So my guy was just sat there, and they were all just looking at me. And I was like, has anybody got any questions? And nobody had any questions. And it was all very awkward. And I just thought, oh, maybe this is just the way it is because this is the first time I've done something like this. But do you know what? Thought I presented it well, and we'd gone through it and all the rest of it. Anyway, I left the room, and my sponsor followed me on. He was like, that didn't go so well." And I was just like, "Oh." And the feedback was that I'd delivered the presentation on the wrong brief, but he'd gone through that brief with me. He gave me the brief. So I was a bit like, "Oh." So basically they'd marked me down and I got 0 points. And it was the first leadership course I've been on, and I was absolutely devastated. And it put me off doing presentations for ages after that because I was so worried about getting it wrong. Every time I got up, I just couldn't get the words out, and I was getting really nervous and all the rest of it. And I did say to him, it was about 12, 18 months later, and I said to him, that presentation really affected me, and the feedback that I got afterwards, they've made me feel really bad, and it wasn't even my fault. And it took me ages and ages before I could do another presentation because I was just so worried about getting it wrong. And that's where, in hindsight, I should have delved into that a little bit deeper rather than just thinking I got it wrong, they didn't enjoy the presentation. And it escalated in my head into this big, huge thing that put me off doing presentations for ages. And that's where now anything comes up like that, I'm like, okay, just let me have maybe 24 hours to think about it and then go back with some questions and just explain to me where it went wrong or what's happening and all the rest of it.
And that's a really interesting example that you've shared, because what you've described there is the feedback was that you didn't hit the brief, but there was no detail around, was your communication style appropriate? Were your slides the right level of depth and the right balance of text and image? How did your actual delivery to that very senior audience go in terms of pitch, tone, timings, etc.? So if you'd have had the presence of mind to have delved and asked more about some of those things, as opposed to feeling embarrassed that you were just told you delivered the wrong brief, actually it could have reinforced that you did a great job of your actual communication in your presentation, and had it have been the right brief, you could have been confident in your delivery. So that trajectory of you then feeling nervous of presentations occurred because you didn't ask some of those questions. And I think it's interesting, isn't it, how when we feel embarrassed, when we feel those emotions, that presence of mind to go, okay, that was your cock up and giving me the wrong brief, but give me some actual feedback on the bit that was important.
Yeah, and that is the key thing, isn't it? If I had have known at that time to just take a moment and go, okay, give me the proper feedback, give me the feedback on the delivery. Yeah, we got the brief wrong. I don't care who we blame for that. But what, how do you think I came across? And I think if I'd have done that back then, that the presentation fear wouldn't have come into it. But it literally took ages, like a good couple of years for me to get over that. And then even then I still had to really force myself into public speaking and the presentations. And it, he did actually say to me, like a couple of years down the line, that he thought my presentations were great. I could not believe it because I was like, I have spent all this time feeling like I was rubbish at presentations and it was just the wrong brief. And I think that's why it's just so important that you just go, okay, I'm hearing this negative feedback. Like, where is it coming from? What does it mean? What else can I learn from it? We always say, don't we, take a pause, just take a moment to think about it. And even if that response is thank you, just let me think about that or let me digest that feedback and come back to you. Even if you standing there thinking, how dare you give me feedback like that? Or taking it from if you're feeling insecure in a certain area, taking that a lot harder than the person expected to for you to receive it. I think that that can be quite tough as well. And there's so much to it. And that's why I think it's good that we've done this episode on it because if people are feeling like that or they've been in these situations, this is the sign, isn't it? That you can get through this and you can deal with the negative feedback and you can actually grow and learn from it.
And I think there's some longer game pieces here as well that I would say can really help with this. So we focused quite heavily on that, how it feels, why it happens, and the importance of managing your emotional response and using that pause to do that. But there's also some techniques that can enable over the longer term to make life a little bit easier and to reduce some of the sting. So one of the things I will talk to clients about is feed forward, which is essentially where you ask for advice about a future situation before you get into it. So I talk about that as seek input, not feedback. So if you're going into that presentation, that could have been you sharing the slides with your line manager. It could be asking about what advice have you got for me for when I'm going into that. And I think we often internalize situations where we're not feeling 100% confident and worry about what feedback we're going to get afterwards. And actually, we could seek input, we could get people's guidance, we could get advice. And I think at that stage, if you can gather more data before you go into a situation or a scenario, that can be easier to handle than going ta-da and then getting told, no, you've done that thing wrong. And so I think that is really key. And the other thing as well is making it a regular thing to ask for feedback, which again feels counterintuitive if you find negative feedback hard to deal with. But what it does is it desensitizes you. If you're consistently asking questions where you are asking for feedback on what did you think of this? How did you think that went? Was there anything you think I could have done better with that? Then you become that person who is easy to give feedback to, but you also desensitize yourself because sometimes you hear great things and sometimes people are a bit middle of the road, but at least you're getting feedback because the absence of any feedback is also really nerve-wracking. The number of people that I've coached where they're like, I just don't know how I'm doing. I'm like, have you asked? Have you asked for feedback? And they're like, no, because I'm terrified of what my boss is going to say.
I know, and that's the thing, isn't it? Because I think when you're worrying about what people might say and you don't ask for the feedback, you build it up in your head, don't you? What you think they're thinking. And 9 times out of 10, they're not thinking what you think they're thinking. And it's crazy that we make so many assumptions around what people are thinking without actually asking them.
Yeah, 100%. And one final thing that I think is really helpful when it comes to responding to feedback is to acknowledge where you've done something with it. And I think this is something that people don't naturally do. So if you've had feedback on your presentation, because we've used that as an example, saying to that person the next time, thanks for that feedback that you gave me about the presentation. I've really borne that in mind and I've tried to make sure that this one is less detailed. So I'd love to know your thoughts on whether that's more in line with what you were thinking. Then what that does is reassures people that you listen and you take their thoughts on board. And again, that will build trust in that relationship. It will make it easier for them to give you that steer and it will give you more certainty that you actually know what people are thinking. So, yeah, just a few other bits and pieces there that I think would be really helpful, even if they're not comfortable for people that struggle to receive that negative feedback.
Yeah, no, that is amazing. And I do think this episode will be really quite helpful for people that have been either dodging asking for feedback or having received feedback and not enjoyed feedback. So if you've been listening today and you know that you're somebody who finds criticism hard, then coaching can really help with that. So get in touch and we'll let you know what coaching options we've got available. And as usual, thank you for listening and make sure that you do rate and review us on your favorite podcast platforms and share the episode with anybody that you think it might be useful for. And we'll be back next time with another episode.